Great. Next, I'd like to invite Jim Walsh up to speak to you all. He is the General Manager of Grid Software Solutions at GE Digital. And he's got kind of the functional area topic here of talking about emerging grid architecture, and take it away.
Got it. Thanks. Hi, everybody. Yeah, it is like an out-of-body experience to be live. I'm waiting for somebody to say you're on mute like 15 times during the meeting. As long as you don't do it at the end, I think we'll be good. Hey, I'm Jim Walsh. I run the grid software business at General Electric. I've been in the role for 6 years. It's been an amazing 6 years. I don't think, though, it is close to representing the amount of change we're all going to go through in the next 6 years. There is an awful lot going on. I'm going to try to just leave you with some nuggets in terms of how we're thinking about architecture, some things that I would suggest you think about. We're certainly not going to be able to unpack kind of the architecture of the future in 15 minutes, but I will try to leave you with some original thoughts. So I'm not going to hover on the left-hand side of this slide. I think you guys have been talking about that all day long, and you've been thinking about it for months and years before that. I think the only thing I would draw your attention to is as I'm looking at it, in the bottom right, where we're talking about this notion of explosion of data. It's a topic I don't think gets talked about enough in the context of thinking about the grid for the future. And it's something where I'm going to suggest everybody needs to have a strategy here. It's going to be an area where we're going to need to come together as providers of solutions, of customers, of regulators, to really think about how we're going to tackle this issue. Because as you'll hear me try to make the case for, I think we need to evolve into a paradigm where the grid is actually being orchestrated as opposed to being run. I heard real-time grid execution, very much the same thing, but data is going to be a big part of it. The other thing I would mention on this slide, maybe just to hone in on the right-hand side of it for a second, I think we've all got to push ourselves as it relates to this notion of partnerships. And that's present company included. I think for us to solve what we collectively are going to need to solve, we're going to have to get out of our comfort zone as it relates to how we do partnerships. A little tiny story from inside of GE, I made a decision at the beginning of the year to separate out a piece of the organization. Because what I found was, as long as they stayed part of the broader ecosystem, the day-to-day business management team, the likelihood of really innovating got diminished. The likelihood of them really partnering with people that maybe we've never partnered with before diminished. And so something I would say to all of you, think about partnership. It's an easy thing to talk about. It's a little bit harder to do, and you may have to be really much more intentional about doing that. So we've talked a lot about what's going on from a decarbonization standpoint and the trends that are impacting. I think, again, to kind of bring it all back together, you got to start to think about the fact that we're really trying to solve for a trilemma, right? It's sustainability, it's reliability, and it's affordability. And nobody's going to give us collectively a pass on any of the three of those. And so if you take that in and of itself is a really difficult, challenging algorithm to solve for. Now you start to roll in things like cyber. You start to roll in things like consumer behaviors will change. And what that leads to ultimately, in terms of a conclusion from my perspective, a company that provides a lot of things into the energy transition, is we need to build things that give us some degrees of freedom to iterate, right? If you think about how we traditionally have built software in this industry, it's been very monolithic, it's been very proprietary. I heard that mentioned before. We've got to very quickly shift to a mode where we're thinking about modular software, or we're thinking about open architectures. Because not any one company is going to drive all of the innovation that's going to be required for us to solve for this. It's going to be a combination, really, of a great big ecosystem. And the only way that dog hunts is if we're modular and we're open. so you guys can read this faster than I can say it. I think you could almost change the name of this slide to the imperatives. Gosh, they changed the slide. They actually listened to me on this one. It originally said, what if? Talk about getting thrown up. It originally said, what if? And I guess my comment is, this needs to be the grid must. And again, I think it represents what the grid needs to evolve into. So I think to talk about the path forward, you need to talk a little bit about kind of where we are. And I won't talk about the grid in its current instantiation from a physical standpoint. I think everybody's well aware of how that needs to transition. But what I would say is over time, as digital has entered into the grid, it's brought a tremendous amount of benefit. It's made things a lot more reliable. It's made us a lot more efficient. But what I would suggest is it's also created a whole bunch of data silos that live across the grid. And my contention is that as the grid gets more complicated, as there's more things that need to be brought into consideration, again, to solve this complex algorithm, we cannot have a grid where we've got data in silos. Everything needs to be viewed through a common context, with a common view, with relations created within the database. And so it's really a move from data that's kind of all over the place, being managed, being collected differently, being interrogated differently, to one where we've got a much more coherent, consistent strategy across the framework. And so as we've talked to customers about this, we get a lot of people that nod their heads and they say, let's have a discussion about where to start. And so what I wanted to do here is just give you 4 things that we've identified as problems we're solving. And they're not necessarily the right 4 for you, but I think they start to bring into question how we eat this elephant, which is ultimately going to be one bite at a time. The very first one references this notion of a common data model. And what I'm really talking about there is one version of the truth. You know, what we see with a lot of our utility customers is 4 different data models representing the same topology, right, as they brought new systems in. And if you think about a reality where you're going to be orchestrating or need to orchestrate the grid, it's awfully difficult to orchestrate when you're doing it from 4 versions of the truth. So a strategy, technology, innovation that needs to happen about how do we get to a common data model. The second thing that we hear a lot of is this notion of just registering DERMs as they come into the mix. Tends to be very manual. It tends to not have a lot of standard work associated with it. And oh, by the way, once it is recorded, it doesn't necessarily get integrated. So how do we streamline that, right? The third area is obvious, I think, but it's keeping the grid stable with intermittent generation. You know, there's new considerations and capabilities that we need to build in to what we monitor and the decisions that we make, things like inertia that previously didn't have to be thought about. And then finally, I think really to parlay on a presentation that was just given, how do we take the brains that are the software and connect it to the body, which is a lot of the controls and automation that needs to exist at the edge. Whoops. I don't know how to go back. There's a maturity model in this deck that I just went through in 1 nanosecond in my desire to get you guys to the cocktail party as quickly as possible. What I would say, saving you from the slide, is simply the way we're thinking about the world is if you contemplate where we exist today, it's largely manual, it's largely siloed, and where we're really trying to take our customers and innovate with our customers is how do you make that much more ubiquitous, and how do you make it much more automated? And I think we're going to need that with the complexity that we're facing into. So the last slide that I would talk to here is simply, there's a lot of work ahead of us. It's exciting work. It's novel work. It crosses all of the constituencies that I've got here on the slides. You know, there's a tremendous amount of upside for society. There's a tremendous amount of upside for each of these constituencies, but I'll kind of end where I started, and that is we're going to have to continue to evolve and work on how do we work more seamlessly together and make it become more of a natural part of what we do. So that's what I wanted to share. Hopefully that had a couple of original thoughts in it following that great group of speakers.
No, absolutely. One question that came up when I was listening, Jim, is really, you mentioned that data and grid operation processes will need to be managed and collected differently. So data collected, processes managed. I wanted to ask you what technologies or kind of structures or operators might you think will need to emerge and exist to help do that either are new, they aren't currently in use now, or maybe they're pilot projects or early stage, or maybe they're developed in other areas.
Yeah, we're working both with other suppliers as well as with customers to really come up with a framework to create the strategy. That's first, right? The technology exists to do everything that I'm talking about, but the challenge has been, up until this point, that every time there's a new innovation and there's a new set of capabilities added on, you've tended to create a new data silo, right? And so when you're trying to evolve to an environment where everything is working interoperably and you've got this notion of orchestration going on, it's really difficult when you've got all these data silos. And so what we're doing is we're spending time with customers. We're trying to come up with a framework that says, look, here's a maturity model, like the one I skipped over. Here's where you are on that maturity model. And based on where you are, let's evolve from there. So I don't think the biggest thing that challenges us here is technology by any stretch of the imagination. I think it's more just philosophy, having a strategy, thinking about data holistically across the enterprise, as opposed to solving problems in isolation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. And you said, hope we took new ideas away from this. And if nothing, the word orchestration was not on my radar. And it's certainly on my radar now, because I think that's a great kind of term to be thinking about when we're talking about grid architecture.
Terrific.
Thank you so much, Jim.
You're welcome. Thank you.
That's excellent.